topic. On one hand, to get the Jewish kid up to help explain the holidays is one thing. Then again, that kid, if he or she's a little bit more shy, they dread it. Like that, oh my God, every holiday I'm going to have to get him up and be the class Jew, right? And so it's a topic I think it touches almost every one of our families, and maybe we can schedule a special one eventually. How's that?
Yeah, Yoni students are fortunate.
I'm glad you think that. I don't think everyone thinks that, but I'm glad that you do, Mark.
Yoni, I wish I'd had you around when I was in high school and I was the token Jew.
Thank you. I mean, I'll be honest, the only reason that I teach is because I had such frustrations in school and I just wanted to be the teacher that I felt like I deserved as a kid. And so that's how I teach Jewish things. That's how I teach anything. It's just, I was very critical. I had two amazing teachers at home in my parents. And whenever I saw a teacher, 1 out of 10 teachers was great and I was their favorite student. And everyone else, I was like, you could do this so much better. And so that I've been on a crusade ever since to just not be one of those teachers.
You are that favorite educator. You're absolutely amazing, and thank you for whenever you get to share. We'll put our heads together, maybe come up with a class which we'll advertise and all the rest. So we're going to say the blessing in just a second. Here's the deal. There are 3 responsa that I have for us to look at. Of course, we won't be able to cover all 3 of them. And I sort of want to give you a vote, but then again, I sort of want to go ahead and just do what I want to do because the one is they're dealing with one of them is dealing with state and in public, state, private issues that touch on the interference of the state with practice of religion. And I thought that was a little bit timely. And there's so many things in the news. And there was another justice one that didn't really cover it. But then I came across this one responsum, which seemed to be perfectly timely. And that dealt with the ethics, the morals, the legality, the humanity of force feeding a prisoner. Why is that an issue? Because Navalny in Russia right now, who is struggling with his life, he went on a hunger strike, but he also was denied medical care by Putin and the Russian monsters that plagued him, poisoned him, etc. So one of the ways he's getting this universal Putin is universal condemnation. And one of the things that they're going to consider, of course, is force feeding him in order to keep him from becoming a martyr. This issue was addressed in 2006, dealing with the prisoners at Guantanamo in the United States, many of whom also went on a hunger strike. And this was an issue that our country wrestled with because we didn't want them to become martyrs either. So force feeding was an issue and was practiced. So the question came to the responsa committee, which I was a part of, and they said, what are the Jewish ethics on force feeding? So I thought, okay, that works. So we have a lot of different issues going on in this world. So with that, and I hope you will find it worthwhile, we're going to get to that and we'll say a little blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise are you, Adonai, our God, creator of the universe, you've sanctified us with mitzvot and you've commanded us to engage with words of Torah. So here's the passage. And I'll make it nice and large. I'm employing the Alan Markman rule because Alan Markman's here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've got some new glasses ordered, so maybe we'll be able to go back to normal. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Now, some of you might notice, and certainly Alan, you will, and the Sorkins and others, Marshall Tobin, that this is a question that came from Rabbi Joel Schwartzman when he was at Morrison, Colorado. He served as an associate rabbi at Temple Sinai for a couple of years in one of our transitions, a longtime chaplain and truly a wonderful rabbi. So this was his she'ela. Well, I'll read it for Joel and then you start with the teshuvah. Okay, Alan?
Okay.
So Joel wrote, what would be the Jewish view of force feeding, strapping someone to a chair and putting a tube down their nose in as painless a fashion as possible? And that should have been in scare quotes, because like, what do you mean as painless as possible? I can't think of anything more grueling. But regardless, a mentally stable prisoner who desires to starve himself to death to make a political statement. So that's his question. And here is the teshuvah. So Alan, you want to start us off? Alan, you go ahead.
Yes. This question arises with respect to the treatment of detainees imprisoned at the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. These detainees were captured during military operations beginning in 2001 against the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization and the Taliban government of Afghanistan. During the summer and fall of 2005, they staged a hunger strike to protest their detention and treatment. In February 2006, various news organizations reported that prison officials were force-feeding the detainees in a manner to that described by our Shoel.
The Shoel is the person who wrote the question, in this case,
Yeah.
Rabbi Schwartzman.
Yes, as a means of breaking the strike. Military officials justified these harsh measures as necessary to save the lives of hunger strikers. The prisoners themselves have charged that both the restraint and the insertion of feeding tubes were accomplished through excessive violence. We composed this responsum in the summer of 2006, a time when the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq are subjects of intense political controversy. We seek, however, to set the politics aside and to view this she'ela, as we do all others, as a Jewish one, involving the interpretation and application of values central to our religious tradition.
I'm going to move this up for a second and go.
With respect to this question, those valued points of view and those values point us in different conflicting directions. This is not an easy question for us, the Jewish view, as our Shoel puts it. It's far from obvious. We will therefore set forth as thoroughly as we can the arguments both for and against force feeding, in the hope that our answer will encompass the valid points raised by both sides and do justice to the genuine complexity of the case.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second, because what we would do when we had our teshuvah class is we would present the issue, and then we would sort of get some reactions as to what are your initial impression, your initial reaction is to the question. And then, because the responsum is pretty detailed and fair, it has a very good representation on both sides, we're able to look at those ethical and moral issues as they are reflected through the Jewish lens, and then we can sort of maybe reconsider our initial impression. So before we start, what are some of the initial impressions that you might have on the issue of force feeding a prisoner?
Would one of them be that one of the ethics or morals of the Jewish people is to save lives in any matter that needs to be saved?
Absolutely. So that's one of them that will definitely come up. It's pekuach nefesh, that we have a moral obligation to save a life regardless. Okay, that's one. Very good. Mel, you next.
Yeah, we generally don't believe that suicide is something that we would condone.
Very good.
This is suicide.
So here's a suicide, again, a violation of the sanctity of human life. So there are two ethical reasons that would be in favor of force feeding, because we're saving a life and preventing suicide. Jerry, you had a thought?
Yeah, I think that if these people are being held against the American Constitution without being charged and without a really legal reason for holding them, where do you come off with the high ground that we're going to force feed you to save your life so we could still keep you against our own laws? It just seems odd to me.
Very good. So this is a violation, not only because they have so little legal recourse, but it's a violation of their basic humanity, i.e. to exercise whatever voice or protest available to me. And they don't have very many in jail. One of them is through a hunger. That's terrific. Who else has something to share? Alan.
What about a person who's force-fed, but he has a directive not to force-feed him? Do we back away from that?
You mean when the courts say you may not force-feed him?
Yeah, say he's in the hospital and he's being force-fed, but he has a directive saying, "I don't want to be
Right. Well, that's, I mean, right. We have the DNR and in the hospitals, but this is a prisoner. And the prisoner's making a particular, so they don't have certain rights. Obviously, they don't have a right of freedom. They're in a jail. But that's certainly a good point. What power does the courts have to this? And obviously, they have considerable power, even vis-a-vis the military. Although it's a little bit more limited. The military has some of its own jurisdiction. Any other
I just
thoughts?
thought that the prisoners can vote.
Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot. It depends on the state. But these were not people who could vote because these were prisoners of war. Anyone else? So let's get to the text then and see what. So here's an arguments in favor of force feeding, and then we'll go to the arguments against in just a little bit. So here's what we've marshaled. And of course, there's extensive footnotes, et cetera, which we can look at if they're germane. So who would like to read the arguments in favor of force feeding?
I will.
Great, thank you, Margie.
Jewish tradition teaches that pekuach nefesh, the preservation of human life, is a mitzvah, a religious duty, and that it transcends and supersedes virtually all others. The rabbis derived this from Leviticus. You shall keep my statutes and my laws, which a person shall perform and live by them. They interpreted the words and live by them to mean and not die by them. Thus, one is to perform the mitzvot in such a way that one's life is not subject to danger. The supreme value that Judaism places upon the safeguarding of life expresses itself in three related rules. First, we are forbidden to cause physical harm, havala, to ourselves, or to place ourselves in any unnecessary danger. Second, the practice of medicine is itself a form of pekuach nefesh and therefore supersedes other conflicting religious obligations.
Let me move this up. Yes, such as?
Yeah, even such serious ones as the prohibitations surrounding Shabbat and Yom Kippur. And third, we are forbidden to stand idly by in the blood of another. That is, we bear a positive obligation to rescue the lives of those who are in danger.
By the way, two of those passages, of those citations come in this week's Torah portion.
Mm-hmm. These teachings raise a sharp critique of the tactics of the hunger strikers. If there is a single uncontested feature of the Jewish view of this question, it is that human life is sacred and that it must be treated with the utmost reverence. Yes, there are times when our tradition would permit and even demand that one die rather than violate a mitzvah. But the circumstances in which this demand applies are strictly limited. In other words, one is not entitled to choose martyrdom in order to make a political statement.
I can move this up a little bit, just 1 second. And
all of this would lead to the conclusion that the prisoners are forbidden to endanger their lives by engaging in a hunger strike, and that of the prison officials who are ultimately responsible for the health and safety of those in their custody are justified in taking strong action, if necessary, to bring the strike to an end. That such action may involve force and violence is regrettable, but the blame for this unhappy result lies in the prisoners themselves. By refusing nourishment, it is they who are endangering their lives. The prison officials, by contrast, are simply following the dictates of Jewish law, which enjoins us to fulfill the obligation of pikuach nefesh quickly and diligently. Whosoever delays in the performance of this mitzvah is guilty of bloodshed. Very strong.
Yeah, right. So we have, we're about to get into the arguments against the force feeding, and they're actually a little bit more elaborate. But this at least sets out pretty strongly, as Margie said, their position. So any reaction to this initially? All right. So let's get back to our text.
One reaction is if those prison guards were Jewish, maybe they had. This is why they were. They would not. They would obey the law to force feed.
Well, right. So there's two levels here, and this is interesting because pre-1948. These are the kinds of answers, the teshuvot that we would get. They were all theoretical because the Jewish community was stateless, relatively powerless, and we would talk about these, we would argue about these issues in a theoretical sense because we didn't get to exercise them. Since 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, these questions are very much germane because there are situations now where Israeli Jews are the prison officials and administrators, and there are others, Jews and non-Jews, who are in prison that may employ a hunger strike. So now it moves from a theoretical to a very real world situation. Now, that goes beyond the case as to whether or not an individual Jewish prisoner, prison official or guard would object as a conscientious objector to carrying out certain activities, and certainly that's legitimate as well. But as the state is the actor here, the state is demanding that of the force feeding. Since over the last 73 years, now Israel is now a part of those states that have to wrestle with this. That's very true. I thought you were going to go with the fact that if there's a Jewish guard and wanted them to eat, that they'd bring in some nice matzo ball soup, or they'd bring an awesome pastrami sandwich, and they say, "Oh, really? Don't you want a little bite? Just a little bite?" But no. That's not one of the responses that we have here, and for good reason. So let's get to, go ahead, Marshall.
Rabbi, but we're making an assumption with this particular case because we imprisoned these people. We're making somewhat of an assumption of guilt, and we're punishing them to punish them further. Now, isn't that kind of a strange thing?
Well, they are guilty because they, at least
they weren't guilty. They were never tried.
Well, in Guantanamo, they were prisoners of war, so they would be governed under other aspects of treatment of those who are in warfare. And there was a question: were they prisoner of war from a state, or were they terrorists, etc.? So you're right. In this case, the specifics of Guantanamo, they may not have had a specific trial. But as we expand this question to those who aren't just in Guantanamo, because the same question we have for prisoners in any of our jails or prisons who employ the methods of protest being a hunger strike, who they may have had their trial, they may have been found guilty, and now they're going to protest because of whatever. And do we have a right, if someone is guilty, because they've been found guilty, to force feed them? So it goes, while the question was then initiated by the question in Guantanamo, it's not exclusive to that. Go ahead, Lori.
So what if what if it's not a prisoner we're talking about? What if it's just a citizen that's using hunger strike to protest something?
It happens all the time, right? We have people who are protesting racism or homophobia or whatever, and part of their protest is a hunger strike, and they get great publicity for it. And the state has a motivation to stop the criticism, to stop the negative publicity. And so you're thinking, dang, the state is now taking away the basic right of this one person to protest in a very meaningful way. So let's, Lori, then with that, I'm going to have you read the next section of the case to permit the prisoners to go ahead with it. Arnie, do you want to jump in real quick?
Just one thing to complete the picture. Everything everybody's saying obviously is correct, but let's throw one other thing in. Western society in general has viewed suicide as a mental disorder. In other words, that basically it's such an inherent instinct to survive. If somebody wants to commit suicide, we intervene tremendously to stop it. So already the pendulum sitting way out to the left. This comes up in a variety of ways. For example, medically, for the docs here, I don't know if you had to deal with Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if you had to deal with Christian Scientists. So there's a difference, but our law in this country and the Western culture is based on the idea that if you want to commit suicide, you're crazy, and we don't kill crazy people. So in fact, medically, the other one that came in, say, in my experience, been, say, with these religious ones, where they're abandoning their children. But the culture is such, find a reason to intervene, period. Now, that just completes the picture. You didn't talk, all the ethics is fine, but we also have a culture of the Western world. Heavily, basically has dealt with suicide as, no, that's crazy.
Good. That's an excellent point, and thank you, Doctor. Lori, would you read this next passage?
Sure.
Starting the arguments against force feeding. As I said, it's much more elaborate.
On the other hand, a case can be made that Jewish tradition does not warrant the force feeding of prisoners who have undertaken a hunger strike. That case rests upon the following 3 points. 1, this is a political, not a medical question. Answers are frequently dictated by the way in which we frame the questions. If we define this question primarily as a medical one, we will tend to ask it as follows. Under Jewish law, is a patient entitled to refuse life-sustaining medical treatment? The answer clearly is no. Under the rule of pikuach nefesh, a patient is morally obligated to accept a remedy that consensus medical opinion regards as refuah beduka or refuah vada'it, one that offers a reasonably certain prospect of a successful therapeutic outcome. If hunger is a disease, then food is a sure remedy for it. Yet we would note that the prisoners themselves do not see this as a medical question. They have chosen the hunger strike as a tactic to protest against the conditions of their captivity. Their goal is to bring pressure upon their jailers, not necessarily to kill themselves or to cause themselves irreparable physical harm. Indeed, the prison officials at Guantanamo concur in this assessment. If so, then the forceful insertion of a nasogastric tube is arguably a political rather than a medical intervention, designed not to save lives, but to break the hunger strikes because they were having a disruptive effect and causing stress for the medical staff. If the strike and the attendant force feeding both serve for political goals, then the rules and principles that apply to a medical context may not be appropriate here. In this connection,
Good. In this connection.
Wait, I lost my place.
Right at the top.
In this connection, we would note that the prohibition against inflicting physical damage upon oneself, to which we refer above, is limited to cases in which the injury is done in a contemptible manner or for no good purpose. Obviously, those who undertake a hunger strike in protest against prison conditions would say that the harm they inflict upon themselves does not fall into that category. We would add that a number of Orthodox rabbis participated in hunger strikes during the 1990s in protest of the Oslo peace accords between Israel and the PLO. Although the strikes were controversial, the fact that they took place suggests that they were able to distinguish on Jewish grounds between an action designed to endanger one's life and health, which would be forbidden, and an action intended to make a political statement.
Very good. Great. Thank you. Do you want to, let's get someone else so you can get a drink. Lori, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Who would like to read point 2 of the position that is against force feeding?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Barbara.
Force feeding. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Force feeding is widely regarded as torture. This policy is set forth by the World Medical Association in its Declaration of Tokyo concerning torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in relation to detention and imprisonment. Where a prisoner refuses nourishment and is considered by the physician as capable of forming an unimpaired and rational judgment concerning the consequences of such a voluntary refusal of nourishment, he or she shall not be fed artificially. The decision as to the capacity of the prisoner to form such a judgment should be confirmed by at least one other independent physician. The consequences of the refusal of nourishment shall be explained by the physician to the prisoner. The American Medical Association, a member organization of the WMA, has reaffirmed its endorsement of this clause of the Tokyo policy. In March 2006, the British medical journal, The Lancet, published a letter of protest signed by over 250 distinguished physicians from the United States and Europe against the force feeding at Guantanamo. The letter, which calls upon the U.S. government to ensure that detainees are assessed by independent physicians and that techniques such as force feeding and restraint chairs are abandoned forthwith in accordance with internationally agreed standards, has garnered the support of well-known human rights organizations. We take these statements with the utmost seriousness. As Jews, we are heirs to a tradition that commands us to pursue justice, Deuteronomy 16:20, and to a Torah whose ways are pleasantness and whose paths are peace. How then can we support a tactic that much of the world's enlightened medical ethical opinion has castigated as a form of torture?
Okay, hold on. Let me get down to this. Okay.
It was to do so. To do so is arguably to perpetrate a Hilul Hashem, a profanation of God's name, an offense we commit whenever we behave in a manner inconsistent with the high standards that the world expects of a people that lives in covenant with God. Wait. Before we reach that conclusion, however, let us consider that the Tokyo Declaration's opposition to force feeding is based upon two principles that enjoy a dominant, some would say a canonical, standing in contemporary secular bioethics. The first of these is patient autonomy, which holds that a medical procedure is ethical to the extent that a competent patient makes his or her own decision regarding that procedure in an autonomous manner, free of coercion. The second is informed consent. The patient agrees to a suggested treatment only when he or she has been supplied with all material information that a reasonable medical layperson would consider significant with regard to that decision.
Great, thank you. And a little bit more applied.
Applied to our case, these principles suggest that when a prisoner makes a rational, informed decision that he does not wish to be fed, we are not permitted to feed him against his express will, even though the decision may result in his death. Yet, as we have seen, the classical Judaic approach to questions of life and death is founded not upon the affirmation of individual autonomy, but upon the commitment to the sanctity of life and the duty to heal. In the traditional Jewish view, the patient has no right to make a decision, however informed, for suicide, and the physician, who like every person bears a positive duty to save life, has no right to sit passively and watch the patient die. The Jewish physician can therefore make a powerful argument that when confronted by a situation such as the one described in Ashahila, his or her ethical responsibility is to save the patient's life rather than to respect the patient's autonomy.
Okay, let's hold on for a second, then because there's a lot there, and thank you, Roberta, for sharing that. What were some of your impressions? I know, Mark, you have your hand up, but unmute and share.
One of the things is that up until now, there hasn't been any mention of whose direction the prisoners are held at. What if they have their own ethical, religious beliefs? And if we did one thing, we'd be violating them, and if we did the other thing, we'd be violating them, or could be.
That's terrific, because martyrdom in Islam is viewed on a whole different level than in the West. And for that matter, the idea of one being a Kiddush Hashem, being a martyr, is well documented in Jewish lore as well. In fact, there are times, 3 cases specifically, in which a person is commanded to fight or to resist, even to the point of the loss of their own life, against either idolatry or profanation, and of course sexual misconduct. So you're 100% right. That's a wonderful point, that we're imposing a different cultural, theological standard of morality on people who would not accede to that, not agree to that. So that's terrific. Who else has?
Rabbi, in November, just in last November, I Googled this because it wasn't 100% in my brain when it happened, but Israel released a Palestinian prisoner who had been held for 103 days. He did not eat. He went on a hunger strike. He was never charged, so that's comparable to Guantanamo. He was just being held as a suspected terrorist, and it worked for him because they let him go. They put him in the hospital and then said, okay.
Yeah. Good. And so
Israel did not choose to force feed this prisoner.
Right. So I'm going to call upon you to help read one of the conclusions, although Barbara has first dibs, because you've been giving a lot of thought to this, so thank you. Anyone else before we get more to their conclusions? All right. So you're just wanting to see how it turns out.
I already gave away the ending. No, I didn't.
No. So Barbara, if you'll read this, where it says, "We do not believe that contemporary."
We do not believe that the contemporary Western model of bioethics is any more exalted, noble, or humane than the Judaic approach. In saying this, we do not mean to disparage modernity or its contributions to moral thought. We mean rather that as heirs to both the classical Jewish tradition and the culture of modernity, we would not wish to live in a society that rejects either source of ethical value. Thus, while we acknowledge that the modern affirmation of the dignity of the individual human being serves in our world as a bulwark against tyranny and oppression, particularly of the sort rooted in religious extremism, We reject the notion that modern, progressive, and Western culture enjoys a monopoly upon moral truth. On the contrary, we believe that contemporary secular civilization can learn a great deal from the Jewish tradition, especially in the realm of bioethics, where the Judaic approach can yield answers that might well be morally superior to those produced by secular thought. As citizens of Western society and participants in its culture, we cannot ignore the fact that the predominant medical ethical opinion in our society and culture defines force feeding of patients as an immoral act. But as Jews, we cannot apply the label torture to a procedure designed to save the life of prisoners in our custody, even if they seem bound and determined upon suicide.
Okay, so Fern, Barbara, why don't you get to this, and then Fern, I'll give you the conclusion. Either one.
Okay, force feeding transgression. Excuse me, transgresses against Jewish ethical principles. Yet even if we view this as a medical rather than a political question, the fact that a patient is obligated to accept life-sustaining treatment does not necessarily mean that we may force it upon her against her will.
Okay, so I put this in single space because I wasn't intending to read it because it gets sort of gross. This is the actual procedure of strapping them down, and it's am I okay to skipping this, or do you guys want to read this too?
We can skip it.
Okay, go ahead. So
well, it does pertain. I mean, I think the point is that it's not just here, have a little bit of soup. It's more like water torture. I don't know what the experience on the part of the patient would be, but it certainly, from all those Masterpiece Theater suffragette things, it looked pretty bad.
Okay, I've got a vote in favor of reading it, and so I'm convinced we got to read it. Right,
we could read it silently.
No, we're not going to do that. I'm going to make you read it, though.
Of course, of course.
I'll make it a little bit larger for you. Hold on.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Here it is essential to consider just what force feeding entails, as one Guantanamo detainee has described the procedure. The head is immobilized by a strap so it can't be moved. Their hands are cuffed to the chair and the legs are shackled. They ask, "Are you going to eat or not?" And if not, they insert the tube. People have been urinating and defecating on themselves in these feedings and vomiting and bleeding. They ask to be allowed to go to the bathroom, but they will not let them go. They have sometimes put diapers on them. Another charges that a lieutenant came to his isolation cell and told him that if he did not agree to eat solid food, he would be strapped into the chair and force-fed. After he refused to comply, he said soldiers picked him up by the throat, threw him to the floor, and strapped into the restraint chair. The nasogastric tubes inserted forcibly against the prisoner's wishes have been said to cause unbearable pain.
Okay.
We have no way, of course, to verify these statements.
Sorry.
Because we're not going to try this ourselves. And we also know that the force feeding has been defended by officials of the U.S. Defense Department as compassionate and humane. Still, it is possible that these descriptions are accurate, and it is quite plausible that harsh, violent measures would be required to compel nutrients upon a prisoner who is determined to refuse them. And it is questionable whether Jewish tradition obligates us to resort to such violence, even when the treatment is necessary to save a patient's life. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, for example, has ruled that medical treatment, though compulsory under Jewish law, must be administered in such a way that it does not frighten the patient. Some of us scare easily. For fear, even though it be irrational, may itself cause him harm or even kill him. It is therefore preferable that the physicians not administer treatment against the patient's will, and the physicians must consider this matter very carefully. We would phrase this point somewhat differently. Medical treatment can be considered obligatory only when it is medicine, that is, when it partakes of the mitzvah of healing, refuah. To the extent that a medical procedure causes significant harm to a patient, it may be said to lose its therapeutic value and therefore its standing as medicine. that the patient would be obligated to accept. We are, of course, in no position to draw a proper balance in this case between the harm caused to the detainee by the violent force feeding and its obvious benefit of saving his life, provided that he was intent upon suicide in the first place. Nevertheless, the concern over the negative effects of these measures must give us pause before we assert that we are morally bound to administer them by force. In addition, even if force feeding could be said to have no objective and observable negative effects, we would still have reason to oppose it. Violence against a patient, even when exercised by medical professionals convinced they are acting in the patient's best interests, is still violence. It is a sort of treatment that offends against our most basic conceptions of kavod habiriot, the essential dignity that all of us, including prisoners, possess as human beings created in the image of God. Force is sometimes necessary in our dealings with others, but it should never be resorted to lightly. And when we do choose that path, we had best make sure that our actions are truly the only available means by which to achieve a vital purpose.
Okay, so we have heard both sides now, not to get into a Judy Collins song. And there's forceful, important, compelling positions on both sides. So we're about to read the conclusion. If you were on the committee, if you're voting, if you were on the Supreme Court, how would you vote? So first of all, Mark had a comment.
I'd have a,
Wait.
what?
Did you say Margie?
Did you say Margie or Mark?
No, Mark.
I think we should assign a second-year medical student to put the tube in. Then they'd never want to have it done again, and they'd still get their nourishment.
Thank you, Mark. I think that would definitely be torture. Who else? Okay, so let's have a vote. From what we've learned from both sides, who ultimately would say, you know what, Jewish law and ethics, human law and ethics, should be in favor of force feeding for the reason being that we would be saving a person's life? And who would say, no, Jewish law and ethics, human law and ethics should be opposed to force feeding a prisoner because that's a violation of their humanity. It's violent and it's coercive in the most disrespectful way. So who would be, go ahead.
So are you just wanting our opinion about people who are incarcerated, or particularly this Guantanamo situation, or across the board?
Okay, well, let's break it down into two. One is specifically, since the question was about Guantanamo, let's leave that first as Guantanamo, because you might say, well, you know, they didn't have a trial, blah, blah, blah. And therefore I'm going to vote one way. And the other would be just a normal, a prisoner who was convicted of a crime and they exercise a hunger strike. So let's just say now we're talking about Guantanamo. Who would be in favor of permitting force feeding? We have 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so. Who would be absolutely opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, no force feeding by 7 to 6. That might be appealed. Who knows? That's the Guantanamo group. Let's just say someone who was in a maximum security prison, and they are so they are convicted of this crime. They are exercising the protest of a hunger strike. Who would say that a force feeding in that case would be permitted?
You know, I'm thinking of is his name Novotny, the gentleman in Russia, who is on a hunger strike right now?
Yeah.
We don't want to lose him.
I agree. I agree. I don't want to lose him either, but this is his way of protesting.
I understand that.
Right. And I mean, the last words he said to his wife was, "I might not see you again," but he knows he's willing to give his life up for this cause.
Unless he comes to the United States.
He had the opportunity not to return. He was in Berlin when he returned. Yeah. They told him not to return. And he knew, I mean, this was something he says, I'm willing to give up my life, to risk my life for the cause I believe in. Right. And now, okay, so you can have Novotny in mind, but would you believe that force feeding is permissible to save a life? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, who would be opposed to it? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have 9. Okay, so your opinion is a little bit more to the fact that we should not permit force feeding for those who are convicted of a crime, as opposed to someone in like a Guantanamo. Let's see what
Rabbi, it's never, I think, a purely academic decision. I mean, for the Israelis did not want another Palestinian martyr.
True.
I would assume that's, they didn't let him go to be nice. I assume they still thought he was a terrorist, but they didn't. They were playing, chicken, and the prisoner won.
Right. Well, that's a very good point, because, and I'll get to you in a second, Arnie, that it's a PR game. If this person dies, I've got a martyr on my hand, he or she is already getting all this publicity as this hunger strike. So in which way am I best serving the state? And so it's not easy. Go ahead, Arnie.
Yeah, just one other variable, just to confuse it even more. Think about what's gone on in this country in the last, say, I don't know how long, the disappearance of the death penalty. Why? Because now, in fact, we're faced with the thing that 30 years later, they discovered DNA and the guy's innocent. Overwhelming. I noticed, I'm just looking at how many docs voted. Most of the docs voted against it because we have seen death as a finality. Things change, but once you allow them to die, there is no change after that. You see what I mean? So keeping them alive is not that big a deal, all right? And force feeding is not like in that, I would maybe send a crew in there that teach them how to properly feed the guy. But final, and that's kind of why the death penalty has disappeared.
Right. Good.
Just to confuse it a little bit.
Yeah, I know, Julia, you had a...
I just wanted to say, the United States did this to some of the suffragettes right before women were given the right to vote. They were arrested after a protest, and they were detained, and they decided, there's a whole movie about this, it's crazy. They decided to go on hunger strike because they truly believed in this cause, and they were force fed, and it was torture, absolute torture. And so I just think it's wrong. You can't force someone who is fighting for something. You just can't. It's what they did to the women. In the end, we got the right to vote because they were willing to give their lives for this. It was crazy that this country would do that, but that's where I'm at.
No, that's a wonderful point. I know Yoni and then Margie.
Yeah, I was also just going to respond to Arnold, what you mentioned with a doctor's perspective. And I think there are at least two big differences between the way that you're thinking about it, it seems, and the way that this is being used. So one, when it comes to, like you said, finality, we're talking about saving a life, right? But to the end of actually making their influence in the world final. Right? So you have a person who is going to live on and endure. They're going to have a legacy by martyring themselves, right? And the reason for keeping them alive is so that they don't turn into something greater than themselves, right? So I think that there's something there about the finality. The way that you permanently silence this person is by force feeding them, right? By keeping them locked up and around. And so I think there's a little bit of a paradox there. And then the second thing is, you talked about comparing it to the death penalty. One, Jewish law and other law recognizes the difference between killing someone and keeping someone alive, right? So there is a very big difference between sentencing, murdering, killing someone, capital punishment, and simply not letting them live, right? So there's a violent difference there. And I think in general, like, this is the difference between a person who is thinking of force feeding as a medical procedure as opposed to, a political thing. I think that in my mind, the reason that this I would consider this as torture and not as a medical procedure is because the purpose of it is to physically, unconsensually, violently exert your dominance over another person, right? That's when I go to the doctor and they do anything to me, they're not exerting dominance over me. They are nourishing me. They're helping me, right? This is similar. It's kind of like the reverse of cutting off someone's air supply by torturing them through strangulation. You're saying you don't have control over your body. I have control over your body. And I think that's also a difference here with in my mind, force feeding. What puts it in that context into the category of torture is that I think it's a little bit dishonest in the responsa or in the responsum to talk about it as if you are saving someone's life. The purpose of this is not to save their life. The purpose seems to be to exert your dominance physically, violently over another person, and kind of metaphorically or not literally to essentially limit their potential of influence in the world, which is why there's the law of, like, the philosophical argument in Judaism of if you kill a person, or it's like killing off a world. If you save a life, it's like saving the lives of everyone. It's the enduring effect of that person's life, their potential onward. And it sounds specifically in a lot of these cases that it's, we don't want to allow them to endure. And so that, you talk about the suffragettes, you talk about Gandhi, it's an effective political tool, and it's a person basically saying, I have control over my body and I'm going to use it even if I am imprisoned and you've taken away my ability to speak publicly, to act publicly. I'm going to control what's in my body. And the force feeding is saying, no. Like, in the same way that I've just like put you in handcuffs or put you in a cell, you also don't have control over your own eating, breathing, sleeping, etc.
Very good. I know, Margie, quick, if you want to share too.
Sure. Where does Bakira Hofshit, the freedom of choice or free will, fit in this argument? I didn't see it as.
Yeah. Although they didn't use the term, I think they certainly alluded to it, that this is the person who is exercising their action of a hunger strike, reject the idea that it's medical, reject the idea of the kuach nefesh. For them, it is, this is my voice. And here's, for those causes that we believe in, the idea that I would give up my life for this, we have always considered that noble. A person who's volunteered to be on the front line fighting for something that is for freedom or for justice, etc. And we make heroes out of them. One twist on this is if you have someone who is a virulent racist, who is a true hateful, hurtful person who indulges in this, and who is also, because of their cause, they want to fight for this whatever hate group they're leading, and they want to be a martyr for that hate group. They want to strengthen that hate group. They want to get more publicity for that hate group. Does the state go, man, we can't buy into this. We cannot give these people that kind of energy. So it's not like, they're not all Gandhis, they're not all suffragettes. Some of these are people that we would think, wow, this is a very dangerous person. But then again, who is judging who's dangerous? It's the state, right? And so the state says, well, this, so it's certainly not a clean issue. We can look at someone who's filled with rage and hate, like the racists that plague our society, and say they don't deserve that right. We could look at the Islamic terrorists of Al-Qaeda and say, look how they dominated and tortured the people that they ruled in Afghanistan, etc., they have abandoned then any shred of humanity. Therefore, we no longer have to treat them in the same regard. But that's a fine line to turn on. I mean, if you are a part of that Islamic world, you may not look at them in the same way. So anyway, let's see what here's the final part of the conclusion. Toward a conclusion. Okay. I don't know who would, anybody? Fern, you were doing so well.
All right, I'll read it fast.
I'll
Toward
read it.
conclusion. Oh, somebody else wants to read it?
No, Fern, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go
What
ahead.
is the Jewish view of force feeding? As we have indicated, we think that there can be no simple one-sided answer to this question. We have encountered powerful Judaic arguments both for and against the practice, arguments based upon Jewish legal and moral values that demand our respect and assent. Accordingly, our response acknowledges the wisdom of all these arguments in an effort to arrive at what we think is the most persuasive interpretation of the teachings of our tradition. We begin from the obvious starting point, pikuach nefesh, the duty to preserve human life and to rescue those in danger, is the overriding Jewish moral concern. In any sort of Jewish view, the obligation to save the life of a patient must take precedence over the desire to respect the patient's autonomously chosen decision to die. This is especially true given that a decision to embark upon a hunger strike must raise concerns as to the patient's ability to arrive at a truly rational choice based upon informed consent. At the same time, force feeding by its nature is a violent, even brutal tactic that shocks the conscience and robs the prisoner of his fundamental human dignity. Although force feeding can, under extreme circumstances, be justified on medical grounds, we think that prison authorities can abuse it all too easily for non-medical purposes as a tool for punishment or discipline. When they do so, we fully agree with those who condemn the measure as a form of torture. It is to be avoided in all cases, except when it is obviously necessary to save the life of the hunger striker. How do we draw a proper balance between these conflicting values and concerns? We find helpful guidance, surprisingly perhaps, in the regulations regarding hunger strikes adopted by the U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons. These provide that a prisoner who embarks on a hunger strike is at first permitted to maintain that action. He is placed under careful medical supervision and food is brought to his cell 3 times a day. Prison officials will make efforts to persuade him to abandon the strike, but they will not force him to do so until a physician determines that the inmate's life or health will be threatened if treatment is not initiated immediately. The prisoner may be fed involuntarily only if the physician is convinced to a reasonable medical certainty that there is an immediate threat to the inmate's life or permanent damage to the inmate's health. The words immediate and permanent are crucial here. They declare that the only acceptable grounds for force feeding are medical, and that those grounds must be sufficiently urgent to remove virtually all doubt that the feeding is medically necessary. These regulations, if adhered to in the case of the Guantanamo detainees, would prevent the misuse of force feeding for other purposes, such as for maintaining prison discipline or for relieving stress upon the prison staff. One final note, the Bureau's rules also provide that when nasogastric tubes are inserted by force, these events should be videotaped. We cannot overemphasize the importance of this point for our teshuvah. The force feeding of prisoners must be carefully supervised, for only in that way can we hope to prevent excessive violence and other mistreatment. This supervision, therefore, should be performed by outside observers who do not represent the prison system or the military. Although this might interfere with the secrecy which currently surrounds the activities at the Guantanamo prison camp, we think it is the best way for the U.S. military to demonstrate its commitment to humane and compassionate treatment of the detainees in the face of severe international criticism. In so doing, they would fulfill the spirit of the Mishnah's dictum that it is essential to display our innocence in the sight of people as well as in the sight of God. It would also meet the high standards set by the United States Declaration of Independence, which proclaims the American people's decent respect to the opinions of mankind.
Good. So I don't know if you, I mean, it sort of hedged their bets a little bit. So we're against it until, against force feeding until, like Natalny, that it looks like if we don't do something right now, he's going to die. But if if we are going to do it, it has to be done by outside experts, and it has to be videotaped, and it has to be done only until he's restored his health. And then presumably once his health is restored, he goes back and he can resume his hunger strike. Go ahead, Arnie.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant solution. I think these pretty smart guys, because what they're saying is your statement is you ain't eating, but dying is not part of that statement that we're going to allow. And I think that's perfect. That's kind of what goes on now anywhere in outside of Guantanamo. You know what I mean? That you cannot eat, but you hit a certain, we don't immediately jump in as a physician. But at some point where it's going to start interfering with your health, most ethics committees give us permission at that point to intervene.
Good. Any other comments?
I may not be correct in this, but I have to bring it up. In the time of war, an officer or sergeant will order his men to fight on the lines, and they could be killed. Yet that evening, not behind the lines, a man says he's going to force, not going to eat. And then that officer and sergeant would have to save him. That's one way he wants them to go into danger and may die, but yet, on the other hand, another situation that for the same man who wants to go on a hunger strike, he has to save him.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
No, it is. These are moral and ethical dilemmas, and as Margie brought out, there's a freedom not only of our will, a freedom of and we should have control of our own bodies, and yet. I thought, Erna, your part at the very beginning, that if someone is suicidal, we do not deem them as a person who has rejected the sanctity of life, but rather that they are going through some kind of emotional trauma, and we should not hold them responsible, and we have to do whatever we can and to treat them not as criminals, but to help save their lives. That may be quite naive. There are those who may be quite sane of their mind and body who decide that they no longer can handle it. Julia.
Listening to all this, I just think it's a little rich that, their response is that we bring the ethics of our government to support these people that we've been treating so badly that they went on hunger strike. And that the issue of why they went on the hunger strike in the first place is never addressed. That how were they treated at Guantanamo? We know, and we know how the suffragettes were treated, and we know that Navalny's probably been tortured. And so, the government could bring their own laws, but the government isn't, they put these people in this position, and it's just horrifying to me. So, I hope Navalny survives. I really do. But at the same time, he's fighting for his country. And it's amazing to me that he's willing to do that. I don't know. I'm surprised that the responsa didn't address that aspect. Because usually if someone's on hunger strike, it's because the political situation has devolved to such an extent that that's their only way of speaking.
Yeah, good. Margie.
Just, I'd like to work towards lessening the power of martyrdom.
Yes.
That's the only way I see any sort of answer to this dilemma. But I'd love to find Navalny another way.
Yeah. Mark.
Well, I think that the communication that this prisoner has with the outside world is all the power that he has at this point. And I just don't think that there should be that much power associated with it. He's a prisoner of war. And I don't think you can kill him, and I don't think he should kill himself. But it's just, I didn't think this was a satisfying conclusion, if it is a conclusion that the committee had.
Yeah.
Is Navalny a prisoner of war?
He's a prisoner of the USSR.
Well,
He's a
Russia.
political prisoner.
They
He's
put
a
him
political
on
prisoner.
Germany
some
now
sort
or
of corruption
something.
charges. They're not real. I mean, he knew what he was going back to when he left Germany. Like, he knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
They-
he
they're
couldn't
charging
leave
him-
Germany.
Poison.
Right. They're charging him not just with corruption, but there's also sedition and revolution. And you know, this country has put to death people for sedition and revolution as well. Barbara.
This is going to be another class, but to digress a bit, what would the Jewish view be of Colorado's right to die?
We have covered that in our Teshuvah class, but we can come back to it because you know, news events happen that refresh the topic, and I think we won't run out of topics, but we'll get back to that one. What the whole idea of the lunch and learn, hopefully, and especially with when we get to a Sheila Teshuvah, is to engage in conversation, to point out certain topics that are not cut and dry, that are not easy yes or no answers. These are political, ethical, and moral dilemmas, the conundrums that we have to sort out. And it's good. I thought we had a great discussion. It was good that we were able to weigh both sides. And I think even as we continue on, certainly with the situation with Navalny, but others who will go on hunger strikes, we'll reflect back on this, and no doubt that sometimes we will maybe adjust a little bit our own positions one way or the other. But I want to thank each of you for engaging this afternoon, and Yoni again for not only saving us by rushing home to get on the internet, but also contributing as you always do on such a very, very high level. So thank you to everyone. We will have services tomorrow, 6 o'clock. We have some people in, we may be full, I don't know. We have a lot of people in. That's really cool. So if you want to come, you have to sign up. Also online, lots of wonderful things. Keep warm, keep good, keep safe. I don't know about you. I haven't had lunch, but I'm starving.
Thank you.